Okay, today I want to go over exposure and how the aperture and shutter speed work together, and to help create exposure and how to get equivalent exposures. This is using the aperture and shutter speed, and the ISO also plays into this, so I'll touch on that a little bit. You can follow on with me with the camera sim. It's at camerasim.com. It's a great little simulator, and it's very helpful understanding the basics of your camera. I put my camera here on manual mode, and I'm going to look at the aperture first. So our aperture is going to be one of our ways to control depth of field. A small aperture number is going to have a very shallow depth of field. If I shoot one at this setting, you'll notice how the background is very shallow. There's not any sharpness in it. You also notice how our pinwheel is frozen because we're using a fast shutter speed. So you'll see the shutter speed is 1,000th. The aperture number is 2.8. So whenever I change my aperture number, I'm going to have to also change my shutter speed because I'm going to keep this needle in the middle. So if I go to f4, you'll notice I'll have to also change my shutter speed to around 500. So these are going to half or double. They're going to be equivalent exposures. So whenever I'm letting in less light through the aperture, it's going to take a longer shutter speed to get that same exposure. So if I keep the needle in the middle and I take a picture now, the values of the picture, the luminance levels are going to be the same. We still have a background which is not over underexposed, but we got a little bit more background. We can see it now. Our pinwheel is starting to blur a little bit because we're shooting at a slower shutter speed. So if I go to 4 to 5.6, I'm going to have to change my shutter speed again. This time I'm going to change it to 250 because it's going to double again in duration. And then my needle's in the middle, and you'll just notice the background's getting a little bit sharper. Our pinwheel is blurring even more. Now, if I change my aperture to f8 and leave my shutter speed the same, I'm going to underexpose the image one stop. It's going to be too dark. So I want to keep this needle in the middle. I could do the same thing. I could, go overexpose the stop too. If I had changed my aperture and let the shutter speed the same, it's going to be overexposed. So what I want to try to do is keep this needle in the middle. And there's going to be times, if you look at the tutorial about bracketing, where if the scene is not neutral to start with, if it's not a neutral gray, that means it has a lot of midtones in it, and not overall not bright or dark. It's going to need compensation. It's going to you're going to follow that needle for the most part. So I'm going to go ahead and go to F8 now. So when I go to F8, this is what usually messes photographers up when they start out, is they go the wrong way with the shutter speed. So if I keep going faster and faster, I'll never get that needle back in the middle, so I'm going to have to go slower. So now we're at 1/25. She looks pretty good, and I actually kind of like the pinwheel, partially blurred. It gives me a sense of motion. I can tell she's at a playground now. So these are going to be decisions you get to make as you take pictures. You're going to be able to control how much sharpness is in the picture through the depth of field and through the shutter speed. So if we move on over to F11, it's going to take a slower shutter speed. Now we're going to go to 60th of a second. And what's going to eventually happen is, our pinwheel is definitely blurred here, and I kind of like this picture too. I can tell she's at a playground. But we're going to end up getting some motion blur because she's actually moving back and forth. Now if I was photographing a mountain, some flowers in the foreground, I don't have to worry about this too much, but I would want to use a tripod, and I'd hope there wasn't any wind blowing because I would get blur from that. But now once we get to a slower shutter speed, we're going to be careful about motion blur and camera shake if we're not using a tripod. So I'm going to go to F16. Slow the shutter speed again. I'm going to double the duration, and I'm starting to get a little bit of blur from the subject now. She's moving on me a little bit. So we go to F22 at a 15th of a second. we definitely have some blur. Now this is pretty much going to be unusable. And I'm sure we've all taken pictures like this. I've done it too. But the thing to remember is my exposure is still fine with this picture. It's the same exposure that I had when I was shooting at 2.8, as in terms of brightness and darkness and midtones. What has changed is the size of my diagrams, of my shutter speed, of the curtain, how long that window is open, the duration, and the aperture, the opening for the aperture, that diaphragm, how big it's opening, how big it is. I also want to just go over briefly your ISO. It also plays a major part in this. My ISO will allow me to double or half my aperture or shutter speed settings also, just like changing my aperture shutter speed will. So it's linked, it's called the exposure triangle. So if I get my needle in the middle, let's get this needle back in the middle here. So I need to go to a faster shutter speed. And I can double my ISO and it's going to change it one stop. So if I go to ISO 400, now I'm going to be overexposing my pictures one stop. So what it allows us to do is my ISO allows me to use a faster shutter speed, or it's going to allow me to use a smaller aperture setting without having to change the shutter speed. So if I double it again to 800, I gain another stop, and that'll either give me faster shutter speeds if I want it, or it's going to allow me to change my aperture, give me more depth of field. Now the problem with this is it's going to add more noise and grain to my picture, and it's going to change the quality of my images. So what I typically want to do is I keep an eye on my shutter speeds, and I think about, am I trying to capture motion? Do I have a tripod? How much depth of field do I want to use in my picture? And I'll let my ISO help determine where to keep those settings. So I usually want to keep my ISO as low as I can to give me the best quality images I can. It's not going to show a lot of noise. So if I shoot one of these, let's just go ahead and go to 1600. It gives me another stop either direction. And if I take a picture, it's going to look a little bit, starting to get a little bit of noise in here. And this is something I'd want to avoid. Now if my picture's not going to be blown up that big, if they're not going to buy a huge print of it, I could probably get by with this. But I would always try to keep the highest quality images I can.